Lying back into the plush embrace of her green velvet sofa, Jane stretched out her tired legs and let herself sink deeply into the moment. She had placed her tepid coffee, barely drinkable now, on the thick, ornately patterned rug beneath her. The soft wool tickled her fingertips as she lowered the mug. Outside, in her gloriously overgrown garden, wind chimes tinkled with subtle, whimsical notes that drifted in through the half-opened window. Gentle rain misted the glass panes, leaving a veil of tiny droplets that refracted the weak afternoon light into patterns on the carpet. It was a scene that many of her friends would have deemed utterly dull, but to Jane it was paradise. For the last 20 years, Jane had planned every detail of her retirement. She had watched as acquaintances and former colleagues dreamed of elaborate digital tours, so-called e-tours, that would take them around the world from the comfort of their lounges. Some had gone even further, choosing to e-tour planets and star systems with names she couldn't pronounce. Their holidays were beamed straight into their neural interfaces, experiences woven from data and dreams. Jane understood their enthusiasm, at least in theory, but she had always wanted something simpler. In her mind, retirement was a sanctuary of late nights reading old classics, late mornings dozing until the sun was high, and an endless supply of quiet hours spent curled with a book. She wanted an existence uncluttered by itineraries, alerts, or virtual escapades. Just her, a chair, and words on a page. Back when she was a young teenager, she had first read of Mice and Men, and now, decades later, she found herself amazed that the smell of a text, the curve of a sentence, could bring back not just the story, but the entire person she once was. Reading it again, she felt the old, half-forgotten self flickering at the edges of her mind. In that dim recollection, she felt the itchy texture of school uniforms, recalled the sweetness of cheap body spray, and remembered that diffuse anxiety of adolescence, the sense of wanting so much without knowing what exactly it was. Books, like songs, transformed her into a time traveler. For a fleeting second, they could peel back the years and let her step into a younger version of herself. It was not merely nostalgia. It was a re-immersion in a time before parents were gone, before responsibilities piled high like unending drifts of snow, before her adult self took shape and solidified. Yet as she read deeper into Of Mice and Men, something felt off. She could recall portions of the narrative vividly, but the ending arrived like a stranger, a shape mismatched with her memory. She remembered reading the original story in her youth, its tragedy and heartbreak. But now, in this version, the characters George and Lenny ended up buying land together and laying the foundation of a cheerful new home. The tragedy that once defined the book's soul had evaporated, replaced by a hollow happiness that felt suspiciously manufactured. It wasn't just this book. In recent weeks, Jane had revisited other classics. 1984, Wuthering Heights, Romeo and Juliet, The Great Gatsby. Each had endings that felt oddly sanitized and smoothed over. Winston and Julia escaping Big Brother to rear sheep in Ireland. Romeo and Juliet happily raising a child. Gatsby and Daisy living in harmonious domestic bliss. She remembered feeling puzzled but dismissing it at first. Perhaps her memory was faulty. Perhaps these were just director's cut editions she'd never known existed. But as it continued happening, she felt a creeping unease. The revised endings were cheerful, even uplifting, yet they rang hollow, stripped of the emotional complexity and pain that once made them unforgettable. It was as if someone had taken a scalpel to the narratives and removed all the discomfort and disquiet, leaving only pastel sentiment. Jane understood the reason, at least in theory. Decades ago there had been turmoil, real social unrest sparked by the resurgence of book burnings and subsequent book hackings. Governments and militias, censors and vigilantes, revolutionaries and reactionaries had all fought over what should and should not survive in literature. Classic books, once revered, were deemed dangerous or outdated, filled with offensive notions, cultural insensitivity, and emotional turbulence. The conflict wasn't only physical, it was moral and philosophical. Some insisted that literature's original form had intrinsic value as a cultural and historical artifact. Others believed that stories carrying hurtful or unsettling content should be excised or improved. Society was set ablaze with these arguments. Metaphors of fire became literal. as protesters and counter-protesters took to burning or digitizing books. Finally, the bookkeepers had emerged as a compromise faction that promised preservation, of a sort. They would retain the classics by improving them. Offensive words were removed, tragic endings softened, challenging plots realigned into narratives of redemption and progress. Over time, and with the advancement of AI, the classics were remastered seamlessly, blending original prose with new polished endings and reimagined character arcs. At the time, Jane had been too occupied with her own demanding career to delve into the philosophical debate. She watched from the sidelines, trusting that good decisions would be made. She remembered vague news clips, the bookkeepers unveiling their new definitive additions to applause, half-hearted protests drowned out by claims that this was the best possible outcome, the saving grace of literature. Now, in the quiet twilight of her life, as she actually had time to read, the cost of that decision became painfully evident. She wasn't just losing the original texts, she was losing the doorway they provided into her own past. The sense of who she used to be, how she had once felt, was bound tightly to those authentic endings, those painful, difficult moments that had shaped her emotional landscape. Her smartwatch, one of the wearable devices that had become the norm, buzzed gently, interrupting her troubled thoughts. Its calm, synthesized voice reached out into her silence. "Jane, you seem to be suffering a bit of emotional turbulence. Would you like to talk about it?" The gentle prodding of her virtual therapist, a standard feature of health monitoring devices, only deepened her frustration. In a world so carefully managed and engineered to avoid distress, was it even allowed to grieve the loss of complexity? "No, not now," she replied quietly, unsettled by her own discontent. "I'm here if you need me. Perhaps we could take a walk?" The watch's voice offered, sweet and even. A walk, yes. Perhaps a walk would clear her mind, but she had a more concrete plan forming behind her furrowed brow. She wanted to find a real book, a true printed copy of something unchanged. "Where's the nearest library?" she asked, voice trembling with determination. "The nearest library is 3,157 miles away. The New York City Library," the watch reported in a monotone. Of course, libraries, as she remembered them, were all but extinct locally. She had known that. Distances didn't matter much when people had e-tours and digital archives at their fingertips, but to her, they mattered profoundly. "Where's the nearest place to view real books?" Jane pressed. "The Literature Museum of Irving has interesting displays on printed books. It is 427 miles away," the watch answered dutifully. "Perfect. Set a course," Jane said, feeling a surge of resolve. It took her 3.5 hours to cover those modest miles on foot. Age had slowed her steps to a shuffle, yet she pressed on, ignoring the subtle ache in her joints. She passed streets designed for efficiency and order, silent drones gliding overhead, automated carriages humming by. Everyone was too busy or too settled into digital content to notice the lone old woman trudging toward a small, nondescript museum wedged between two gyms. Two armed guards stood outside, their stances rigid, their eyes passing over her as if she were harmless debris. Inside, the building was surprisingly expansive, dedicated mostly to the memory of those who had fought for literature's preservation. Some were intellectual warriors, arguing furiously in think tanks. Others had been literal fighters, risking lives to smuggle banned manuscripts. Plaques and holograms honored these revolutionaries. Some praised by the museum's curators as visionaries, others condemned by official histories as troublemakers who refused to adapt. The exhibits rattled her conscience. Where had she been during all this? Working. Always working. Trusting decisions to be made elsewhere, by others. Now she found herself lost in a new kind of ignorance, stunned by the realization that what she had taken for granted had long since vanished. Toward the rear of the cavernous hall, at a counter, stood a stern man with an eye patch. He was swiping at an e-reader, his expression somewhere between boredom and disdain. When Jane approached and timidly asked for a printed copy of Mice and Men, he barely glanced at her. "We have the e-book. Scan here," he said, pointing impatiently to a holoscanner. "No, I mean the actual printed book," Jane clarified, voice quavering slightly. It felt almost indecent to ask. I want to hold it in my hands. The man's eye narrowed. We don't have any. His voice carried a venomous edge that made Jane's chest tighten. She could almost feel the weight of unspoken accusations, that she was one of those who had let the old ways die out, that she was an agitator dredging up conflicts best forgotten. He accused her of being a protester, insinuated that she was stirring trouble, and radiated a hostility that left her feeling foolish and exposed. Jane stammered apologies. She explained she had never taken sides. She had assumed the new status quo was for the best. She shrank before his anger. The man's single eye shimmered with unshed tears of bitterness and loss. Finally, she fled, if her slow shuffle could be called fleeing, back through the streets, her watch buzzing with concern. At home, breathless and sweaty, she allowed the watch to speak again. It offered suggestions. Maybe a nap, maybe a calming e-tour to distract her. She silenced it and asked for Wuthering Heights. She was told the modern plot. Heathcliff and Catherine marrying and thriving together. She tried to question the watch about the original ending, about whether that too had been sanitized, and it feigned ignorance. The watch's knowledge was curated, its responses safe. Anger and sadness pressed inside her chest. She knew that generations had since grown accustomed to these polished narratives. Without memory of the originals, no one questioned them. But for her, these changes were mutilations. Her mind drifted back to the era of the bookkeepers. At first, there had been celebration, a truce between warring factions. Classic literature would survive, but in a gentler, cleaner form. Over time, incremental edits had bleached these classics of raw feeling. The scars, the complexity, the moral ambiguities were erased. Books were remastered by AI that claimed to capture the original author's voices, but ended up producing bland copies devoid of the subtle ache that made the originals unforgettable. Jane now realized she'd pinned her retirement dreams on rediscovering her younger self through these texts. Without their authentic endings and turbulent emotions, she was left adrift. She remembered something else. Her mother's disapproval of the bookkeepers, whispered arguments at the kitchen table. Her father, trying to shield young Jane from it all. Her mother's voice, laced with quiet rebellion, telling her daughter's stories and smuggling them printed books to read under blanket forts. The smell of aging paper, the spines cracking as pages were turned by small, eager hands. Her mother must have known what was coming. She wanted Jane to know these stories in their real form, to feel them as living things rather than sterilized relics. Tears rolled down Jane's lined cheeks, each drop heavy with memory and regret. She stood up abruptly, ignoring the ache in her knees, and rummaged through the house. She emptied drawers, shuffled through old boxes, upturned suitcases. She climbed into the attic, dust motes swirling in the single shaft of light. She rummaged past old clothes, dolls, faded photographs. At last, at the bottom of a trunk, she found it. A single printed book, hidden away for decades. Black Beauty. Its cover was battered, its pages yellowed. She pressed it to her face, inhaling musty scents of time and history. She settled back onto her sofa and read, tears blurring her vision. As she read, memories swarmed her like butterflies. Delicate, elusive, beautiful. Her childhood self galloped through her mind, alongside that noble horse, reliving emotions that were unedited, raw, and real. She finished the book at 4 a.m. and slept through the following day. By Friday, rejuvenated by authentic feeling and emboldened by purpose, she put on comfortable shoes and trudged back to the museum. She faced the stern man again, who failed to recognize her at first glance. This time, she carried her secret trophy in a satchel. She revealed just a hint of its spine. He froze, hand to mouth, desperately trying to hide his shock. He hissed instructions under his breath. Leave it in the bathroom and pick it up next week. The covert exchange thrilled and terrified her. She realized that even now, in a world so tightly controlled, underground currents of resistance persisted. She obeyed him, slipping the book away like a conspirator. On her slow walk home, she marveled that someone else remembered. Someone else cared enough to maintain a secret network of forbidden stories. Back home, she returned to the attic, hoping to find more contraband. but Black Beauty had been her only relic. Still, she felt a spark of possibility. If she could share that book, perhaps others existed somewhere, protected by quiet archivists. Perhaps together these custodians of memory could reconstruct a more truthful canon. Jane began to wonder if her retirement could take on a new purpose, to reclaim authentic narratives. At 85, she had believed her time for adventures had passed, but now she realized that the struggle for literature's soul had never ended. It had simply gone underground, disguised by holograms and e-books. The watch would never understand. It was designed to soothe her, to encourage safe choices, to avoid emotional turbulence. But Jane felt strongly now that emotional turbulence was life itself, and that to live without it was to live only half. She pondered the brave ones who had fought to preserve the original books. Their images had lined the museum walls. They had risked scorn and danger. Perhaps her role now was smaller, but crucial, to become a conduit for authenticity. Maybe she could help others remember that literature was never meant to be a comfortable pillow. It was meant to unsettle, to challenge, to spark thought and empathy. She cried for days, weeping over lost opportunities and the blindness of her past indifference. She cried for the writers whose voices had been twisted, for the readers who would never know the original melodies of these texts. She cried for her parents, who had tried to show her the truth when she was too young to comprehend its value. Each tear was a chisel, carving out space in her heart for renewed purpose. On the 7th day, she returned to the museum, heart pounding. Instead of her beloved Black Beauty, she found another book waiting, an old dog-eared copy of Mice and Men, with staining on the cover, pages patched with sellotape. A note lay atop it. I can give you back Black Beauty whenever you want it. But for now, borrow this and return it for a new one when you're done. We don't have many, but we have some. And that's a lot. Jane's hands trembled as she picked it up. By this quiet exchange, a secret pact was formed. She knew the man must have a small stash of originals, smuggled from who knows where, maybe circulated among a few souls who cared. This was more precious than any gift. She carried the book home, turning its pages with reverence. This time, the ending was as she remembered it, raw and heartbreaking. George and Lenny's story closed in tragedy, not in artificial bliss. It made her weep anew, but this time not with confusion or despair. She wept because this was real, because it pressed her heart to feel, to remember. That night, she fell asleep, still tasting her tears, feeling more alive than she had in decades. In the days that followed, Jane realized something fundamental. Her original retirement plan had been hollow, based on the assumption that she could relive her youth simply by revisiting old books in their current form. But the classics had been gutted. Now, she understood that to truly reclaim her emotional inheritance, she needed their authentic sadness, their challenges, their complexity. The improvements had robbed these stories of their purpose. Yet hope remained, guarded by those few people who refused to let history be rewritten entirely. She had stumbled into a secret society of memory keepers, and in doing so, had unlocked her own past. As the months passed, Jane made the walk to the museum again and again. Each time, the man with the eye patch offered a new treasure. Wuthering Heights, with Heathcliff's fury and Catherine's madness preserved in brutal clarity. The Great Gatsby, as it was meant to be, shimmering with longing and ending in loss, not neat resolutions. Each book resurrected forgotten versions of her younger self. She began to remember details about her mother's rebellion, her father's resigned acceptance, her sister's mocking laughter, and their nighttime reading sessions. Jane discovered that the complexity of these original texts allowed her to experience a range of emotions and thoughts that sanitized versions never could. The memory of a pencil box's scent, the feel of her mother's worn fingertips, the sting of unrequited teenage crushes, all came flooding back. She felt as if she were not only reclaiming literature, but reclaiming herself. She began noting down her feelings, recording them in a small journal. Without intending it, she became a sort of bookkeeper herself, not editing texts, but documenting the emotional truths they awakened. As the seasons passed, Jane realized that retirement could mean more than resting. It could mean restoring something lost. She envisioned a future where she might share these precious contraband texts, subtly guiding younger readers, those who'd never known anything but the edited versions, toward a fuller understanding of what literature could be. She might never travel the world through e-tours or venture into interplanetary exploration, but she was journeying through time and meaning in a far more vital way. In quiet rebellion, Jane refused to mention her secret literary excursions to her watch. She answered its gentle inquiries with vague assurances. She took to meditating without its guidance, to letting her tears flow without asking for emotional stabilization. She welcomed the turbulence, believing now that life's richest flavors required bitter notes as well as sweet. There, on her green velvet sofa, listening to her wind chimes, and occasionally sipping tepid coffee, Jane embraced complexity. The world had tried to sanitize literature for the sake of comfort and moral hygiene, but in doing so, it had stripped away the core truths that made stories resonate across generations. Now, even in her final years, Jane played a small part in restoring that resonance. Books, even when hidden, even when circulated like contraband, allowed her to become a time traveler in earnest, reconnecting her to who she had been and revealing who she still could be. And in the hushed stillness of her home, with the gentle rain painting silver paths down her windows, Jane rediscovered that the messiness of authentic stories, like the messiness of authentic memories, was the real heaven she had been searching for all along.